Good evening, this is Goldie, also known as Mr. Anecdotal, Mr. Pasty, and the Talking Head. It's Wednesday, June 15th, 2011. Remember, I rant so you don't have to. If I don't have your email and you'd like to receive the script of each show, send your email to my new email address, which is goldierant@gmail.com. By the way, I do not look at the chat on Ustream. Send me an email instead, I may be able to comment. Tonight, Lou Dobbs was on O'Reilly, complaining about bundlers for Obama getting jobs in government. These guys sit there and complain and complain and complain. They don't read their emails that I send them. They don't look to the core of the problem. They might say something like politics as usual, but instead what they do is say that we need to elect Republicans to solve this problem. They do a disservice to their listeners and viewers. I've talked about this before with Russia's 40 million people. If you're going to talk about a problem, identify the actual problem. Don't complain about the GE CEO, chairman of the board, that's friends with Obama. He was friends with George Bush as well. Talk about what the actual problem is, and then once you've identified the actual problem, then maybe you can do a service and come up with an actual solution. Until you come up with the actual problem, just saying we're going to elect Republicans, come on now, it's ridiculous. All right, here's a brief summary of what I'm going to talk about today. I'm going to talk about fracking again. I'm going to talk about Democrats that enjoy killing Libyan babies. I'm going to talk about NATO and how it is a metaphor for the free rider problem of the world commons, for which I do not have a solution. Sorry. From the Awesome American Statesman, June 14th, 2011, an op-ed regarding our old friend fracking. It's entitled "Fracking Poses Environmental and Public Health Challenges for Texas." And this was done by the Safe Fracking Coalition, June 14th, 2011. As communities in South Texas come to grips with the frenzy of oil and gas activity taking place in the Eagle Ford Shale, questions related to public health, the environment, and future water availability must be answered and dealt with. Much is at stake. Texas' position to lead the nation and world in new oil and gas production and the long-term health of its people and protection of its natural resources. Our state and nation do not have a cohesive regulatory policy to assure the American people that this highly lucrative activity, which entails controversial drilling and fracking techniques, is safe for our air, water, land, and health. So they've added health to the commons. The rush to drill and frack as many wells as possible has created an unexpected boom in these slow economic times. Drilling permits in the Eagle Ford, a 24-county South Texas shale play, hit 1,010 in 2010, up from 94 permits in 2009 and 26 in 2008, according to state data. In the first 4 months of 2011 alone, 743 permits have already been issued. But the lack of adequate regulations and enforcement at the state and federal level to monitor this explosion activity could also lead to one of the greatest environmental and public health challenges of our time. It sounds like these guys have been reading and watching my rants. We don't have to look far to know that after energy and fracking companies set up drill pads and heavy equipment to draw out oil and gas miles below that volatile organic compounds dramatically proliferate in the air, water wells are no longer usable, and people get sick as levels of toluene and xylene and other carcinogenic chemicals are soon found in their bodies. This has been the case for Dish, a small town in the Barnett Shale play near Fort Worth. A recent peer-reviewed study by Duke University scientists in Pennsylvania's Marcellus Shale has shown elevated levels of methane gas in groundwater near fracked gas wells. And we talked about people turning on faucets and then being on fire, being able to be set on fire. But what makes this unfolding story more disturbing is the lack of studies to explain the impact of this activity on humans and the environment, and the inability to know what to test for because we don't even know what is being pumped into the ground. And yet the drilling intensifies. In the 2005 Energy Policy Act, Vice President Dick Cheney drafted a clause that ensured that, now he didn't draft it, Halliburton drafted it. Dick Cheney drafted a clause that ensured that hydraulic fracking would be exempt from the Safe Drinking Water Act, the Clean Water Act, the Clean Air Act, and other major environmental laws. This Halliburton loophole stripped the EPA of any federal oversight of this new oil and gas bonanza and threw it into the lap of state regulators. But in Texas, the Railroad Commission, which is almost sole jurisdiction over the oil and gas industry, proudly displays on its website an article entitled, "The current EPA study on hydraulic fracking is a $12 million solution in search of a problem that doesn't exist." That's on the that's on the Railroad Commission website. Furthermore, much praise was given to the Texas legislature this session for passing House Bill 3328, which will require companies to list the chemicals and quantities of fluid used in fracking. But the watered-down bill would not require them to disclose any chemicals which are considered trade secret. All those chemicals will be trade secrets. When the lives and health of the general population are concerned, some mechanism needs to be put into place to protect the public while still protecting the proprietary interests of the companies. Possibly a blue ribbon committee of trusted officials with scientific training could be established to determine if trade secrets pose no threat to the public. Leaving this determination strictly in the hands of the companies who stand to make profits from the use of such chemicals is a recipe for disaster. We must ask why our health and our natural resources have been placed into the hands of a state agency that seems to devalue science and oversight. We must demand better than that. The Railroad Commission plays a confounding dual role in our state. On the one hand, its mission is to ensure community safety and protection of our natural resources, but on the other, it also works to promote the oil and gas industry. This powerful agency allows a company to use as much groundwater as needed to complete a well. In northwest Webb County, that amounts to nearly 7.56 million gallons of water to frack one well. Each colorful storage tank on Del Mar near Mary Help of Christian School stores 5 million gallons of water. So imagine the quantity of water being consumed in our region when 1.5 of those tanks is needed to frack a single well that can be fracked multiple times. Yet the Railroad Commission and Texas Water Development Board tell us that no entity in Texas is monitoring the amount of water used in this new wave of drilling for hydrocarbons, nor its impact on our future water resources. This is unacceptable, and this is by this group of the Safe Fracking Coalition. This is really a good letter to the editor. As far as the proprietary interests in the companies and that little exemption that they had there, we have been able to get over that hurdle with nuclear power plants. Apparently the Nuclear Regulatory Commission knows exactly what you've got in there. So that doesn't seem to be that big of a deal. But it is here. And let's go back to this. So Cheney was able to get a bit of legislation that benefits his past and current employer into this bill in 2005. Remember, everybody was wondering what went on in there? Well, you in Texas that get cancer, that's what went on. It's okay for you to get cancer so long as the taxpayers subsidize fracking. He knew he was going back to that company, and we, the taxpayers, are paying for it. Again, I must ask, where are the constitutional conservatives on this issue, Tea Partiers? And why are they not asking the users of this technique to pay the actual costs of fracking? And that's really what this op-ed brings up, the actual costs, the healthcare costs. Why is it that the taxpayers are paying for it? I wouldn't mind it so much if the gas production that you paid for that came out of here actually included funds for the future healthcare costs of the people around it and whatever healthcare costs are of the air pollution that's occurring, rather than taxpayers, users of the gas. That's, if you were a constitutionally, fiscally conservative person, you would want. You want the actual cost to be paid by the people who are benefiting. I don't know why we taxpayers have to subsidize this kind of thing. It's because we're stupid. All right, Jim Hightower, who writes editorials, he's in the Texas Observer, he helps a little on the bigger issue of the structural regulatory defect, which is the ability of Cheney to go back out of public service, back onto the board of Halliburton, and then obviously give them beneficial legislation during his time as vice president. This is from the Texas Observer, June 14th, 2011. And I talked about how the need was really for a constitutional amendment to say that Exxon is not a person and isn't allowed to donate any money to a political campaign, term limits, and no regulators ever go back into companies that they've regulated, as well as legislators going into companies. So you would be a true citizen politician if you became a senator or rep. That's my cure for the structural regulatory defect. I do not believe legislation will help it. However, Jim Hightower says a little less corporate political corruption. Come on, Obama, do it. Do it. Stand up, stand tall, stand firm. Yes, you can. The president is thinking about issuing an executive order that would mitigate some of the damage done by the Supreme Court's Citizen United edict. The ruling unleashes unlimited amounts of secret corporate cash to pervert America's elections. Obama's idea is to require that those corporations seeking federal contracts disclose all of their campaign donations for the previous 2 years, including money they launder through such front groups as the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, is actually what he means. This approach says to those giants sucking up billions of our tax dollars for endless war and privatization of public services, you're still free to shove trainloads of your shareholders' money into congressional and presidential races, but hey, just tell the public how much you're giving to whom. Neat. It would be a clean, direct, and effective reform. The corporate powers and their apologists are squealing like stuck pigs. Stephen Law, a Bush Cheney operative who is now a Wall Street Journal editorialist and head of a secret corporate money fund, recently decried the idea of public disclosure of contractor campaign contributions. When I was in the executive branch, he sniffed, mixing politics with procurement was called corruption. Yes, Steve, and y'all were corruption experts. Perhaps you've forgotten that we remember Halliburton, the Cheney-run corporation that helped put Bush in office and then was handed tens of billions in contracts, becoming the poster child of corrupt no-bid procurement. Come on, Obama, don't back down. Sign that disclosure order. If they're going to steal our election, at least make them admit it. Of course, okay, that's the end of that little editorial. Of course, the Republicans are calling this potential executive order a way for the Democrats in power to exclude Republican donors from getting contracts. I agree and disagree. Let's talk about this just a tiny bit. Yes, and it goes back to the Lou Dobbs O'Reilly complaint about how these bundlers are getting all of these jobs and contracts. If you disclose, disclosure is good for our purposes. I would rather over-disclose and run the risk of having to bring back a CIA operative from Pakistan than under-disclose. Under-disclosure harms us all. So to the extent that he can sign this executive order and require any contract that's going to anybody, they're going to have to say who they gave and how much. By the way, you're going to find out Halliburton gives tons of money to Democrats. That's the dirty little secret. And unions give tons of money to Republicans. That's a dirty little secret as well. So, yes, it will allow the party in power to exclude the other donors or whoever they don't like. They already do that. They already know how much money is being given by Halliburton. They already know. They have an idea. They certainly know the direct funds. So they know when John Cornyn gets some airtime bought for by Halliburton, they know it. When Nancy Pelosi gets airtime bought for her by Halliburton or Exxon, they know it. It's these U.S. Chamber of Commerce ones. You just look at the members of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. It's not that secret. Koch brothers funding FreedomWorks and then FreedomWorks giving money. The same type of thing. So it's something I support, but the point of an executive order is it'll go away when Rick Perry becomes president in 2012. I was in a microbrewery last night, and there was a gentleman that was doing a bit of complaining that you can't change human nature. He was referring to all of these Austin environmentalists that want to change every close-in land use to mixed use and bring everyone downtown, and then traffic will be much, much worse. That's what he was complaining about, was traffic. He said people are used to and like driving out to the suburbs. He said we need better east-west roads. I let this rich, non-fiscally austere Republican finish and then asked a few pertinent questions about the real cost of gasoline. I asked, why aren't the costs of the Iraq War and the Libyan War put into the price of gas and not put into the federal budget that's paid for by the taxpayers? Why aren't the costs of fracking, cleaning up the hazardous materials from fracking, the cost of cleaning up the drinking water that the hazardous materials from fracking pollute, and the healthcare costs of the cancers that the people who drink the water contaminated by fracking paid for by the people that consume the gasoline and not the taxpayers? He was drinking. He did not like someone shredding his thin veil of hypocrisy. He did not have, forget an answer, he didn't have any answers. It was classic. I mean, I was willing to talk. I had my buddy standing next to me, and he kind of stood back while I did it, and I realized that this rant has helped me avoid this type of confrontation that might have gone on for many, many minutes. Instead, it was over before it began. Remember, I am not trying to convince him of anything. I'm trying to find the problem first, then identify some solutions. If I need to use Glenn Beck or Hannity or Rush to get my message across, so be it. But I want to identify the problem. He was sitting there drinking and whining that we need more roads. Yet this is going to be the same type of guy that is saying that our budget is too much and government's out of control, except for the items that he wants. Classic hypocrite. Classic. It looks like the concept of the real cost of something is a difficult concept for most people. I ranted months ago about this 1 terabyte backup drive that I bought for $100. And I opined that this cost did not include a deposit for the return of this device for proper disposal, or disposal of any of those toxic things that are in it or any of the valuable things that are in it. Also, last week, I talked about an article in Car and Driver that talked about some of the real costs of batteries that go into the hybrid cars, like the Prius, and how these costs in thousands of lives in Africa are not included in the cost of the car. Maybe these lives are worth zero. There was an article in today's New York Times that sheds further light on the real cost of batteries, and also sheds a little light on globalization and the movement of jobs away from the countries that recognize and make companies pay the real cost of some of their activities to countries that don't give a shit about sick people or pollution. This one was entitled Lead Poisoning in China, The Hidden Scourge, by Sharon Lafreniere, published June 15, 2011. I'll read a little. On a chilly evening, this is in Mengzi Village, China. On a chilly evening early last month, a mob of more than 200 people gathered in this tiny eastern China village at the entrance to the Zhengjiang Haju battery factory, a maker of lead-acid batteries for motorcycles and electric bikes. They shouldered through an outer brick wall, swept into the factory office, and in an outpouring of pure fury, smashed the cabinets, desks, and computers inside. News had spread that workers and villagers had been poisoned by lead emissions from the factory, which had operated for 6 years despite flagrant environmental violations. But the truth was even worse. 233 adults and 99 children were ultimately found to have concentrations of lead in their blood up to 7 times the level deemed safe by the Chinese government. Can you imagine that? What that level is set at? Probably somewhere in the way we set it. And they can do whatever they want over there. One of them was 3-year-old Han Tiantian, who lived just across the road from the plant. Her father, Han Zhanyuan, a factory worker, said he learned in March that she had absorbed enough lead to irreversibly diminish her intellectual capacity and harm her nervous system. At the moment I heard the doctor say that, my heart was shattered, Mr. Han said in an interview last week. We wanted this child to have everything. That's why we worked this hard. That's why we poisoned ourselves at this factory. Now it turns out the child is poisoned too. I have no words to describe how I feel. Such scenes of heartbreak and anger have been repeated across China in recent months with the discovery of case after case of mass lead poisoning, together with instances in which local governments tried to cover them up. In the past 2.5 years, thousands of workers, villagers, and children in at least 9 of mainland China's 31 province-level regions have been found to be suffering from toxic levels of lead exposure, mostly caused by pollution from battery factories and metal smelters. The cases underscore a pattern of government neglect seen in industry after industry as China strives for headlong growth with only embryonic safeguards. Chasing the political dividends of economic development, local officials regularly overlook environmental contamination, worker safety, and dangers to public health until forced to confront them by episodes like the Haju factory riot. A report by Human Rights Watch released Wednesday states that some local officials have reacted to mass poisonings by arbitrarily limiting lead testing, withholding and possibly manipulating test results, denying proper treatment to children and adults, and trying to silence parents and activists. By the way, Canada raised the safe level of amount of iodine that you can absorb into your blood after the nuclear accident in Japan. What we are trying to underscore is how little has been done to address the massive impact of lead pollution in China, Joe Imon, the organization's health and human rights director, said in an interview. It really has affected a whole generation of kids. In more developed nations where lead pollution has been tightly regulated for decades, a pattern of lead poisoning like China's would most likely be deemed a public health emergency. High levels can damage the brain, kidney, liver, nerves, and stomach, and in extreme cases cause death. No blood lead level has been found to be safe for a child, Dr. Mary Jean Brown, chief of the Lead Poisoning Prevention Branch of the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, said in an interview last week. No levels are safe. I'm going to keep reading, but I want to, my point here is going to be getting to how do we stop them from doing this? Because I don't actually believe there is a way to do it. That's why these smelters have gone to China, and these lead acid battery manufacturers have gone to China. Because we don't allow them here. All right, back to the article. Here, Chinese leaders have acknowledged that lead contamination is a grave issue and have raised the priority of reducing heavy metal pollution in the government's latest 5-year plan, presented in March. But despite efforts to step up enforcement, including suspending production last month at a number of battery factories, the government's response remains faltering. At a meeting last month of China's State Council, after yet another disclosure of mass poisoning, blah, blah, blah. All right. This is a point that is never brought up by union-leaning Democrats or corporation-leaning Republicans, and that is the discussion that the real costs of batteries do not include the health effects that will cost billions in the future. That is one of the reasons that those jobs went overseas. The actual cost of the production of batteries in the United States would have to include cleanup costs of water and land. And if the U.S. citizens pulled their heads out of their asses, would include the future health care costs of such battery production, cleanup, and ultimate disposal of the used batteries. That sounds exactly like fracking. Oh my God, it's the same exact issue, except that that oil and gas is here in this country. So we actually have something to say. Now, the production is over there, and I actually cannot think of a solution because we don't have a constitution, a world constitution, with enforcement. I mean, we have it here, and it's the price we pay for wanting to keep our environment clean. We lose jobs. But I don't know how to enforce it against China. We'll get to it later on this NATO thing, the free rider thing. China's basically a free rider. There's no rules determining how much lead can get in the air or into the water or then go into the rivers, into the ocean that then we eat the fish from. It's not an easy problem. And I haven't quite gotten to the heart of the problem yet before I can get a solution or before you can help me get to a solution. By the way, Batteries Plus in the U.S. will accept any battery for recycling. So definitely, if you see a battery on the ground, pick it up. All right, let's move on to dead Libyan babies. There was this gentleman who I visited with over the weekend who was a Democratic Party-leaning libertarian. At least that's what he called himself. He definitely voted for Obama. We both ran it for a while and were pretty aligned, except that he is a bit older and definitely wealthier. And it's probably impossible for him to divorce what is good for him from an in-depth analysis of the structural regulatory defect, for example. He has given up on constitutional amendments because he believes that they cannot be done. Well, I realize that it is extremely important for us to stay away from this type of apathy. What we all do here in this rant and in between rants is engage in the same type of dialogue that goes on among the elites in elite colleges with no holds barred. In other words, we, you and I, are never saying anything to insult anyone else. We are trying to really identify the problem. That is at least half of it. Once you have identified the problem and can properly articulate it, you can then begin to think about solutions and chances of those solutions ever happening. You cannot jump to the second step until you have completed the first step. So I don't want to hear, you can't get that done, until you have articulated to me the actual problem. Also, I want to point out how I knew that he is a Democrat. And that is my comment, that he was probably okay with killing Libyan babies. I said that to him. I go, so I guess you're okay with killing Libyan babies. When I said that, all he replied was, what Libyan babies? You may remember that I am enraged with Democrats that were anti-war during the Bush presidency, but are now ambivalent about the killing of Libyan babies, and most are insulted when I say that they are okay with killing Libyan babies. If someone says, here's the trigger, if someone says, what Libyan babies, then you know they're a Democrat. Okay? If you say Libyan babies to a Republican, generally speaking, they're going to go, I know, we shouldn't be there. Obama doesn't have the authority. So those are your good triggers. Just use them. You'll find out if somebody's a Democrat immediately. All right, slightly related, from the New York Times, June 11th, 2011, an editorial, Talking Truth to NATO. It was June 10th, I guess June 11th, 2011. Defense Secretary Robert Gates spoke bluntly to America's NATO allies on Friday. They needed to hear it. America's key strategic alliance throughout the Cold War is in far deeper trouble than most members admit. The Atlantic allies faced a host of new and old dangers. Without more and wiser European military spending on equipment, training, surveillance, and reconnaissance, NATO faces, as Mr. Gates rightly warned, a dim, if not dismal, future, and even irrelevance. So you got to give more. The Secretary is retiring at the end of this month, which is likely one of the reasons he jettisoned the diplomatic niceties, but not the only one. As he made clear, this country can no longer afford to do a disproportionate share of NATO's fighting and pay a disproportionate share of its bills, while Europe slashes its defense budgets and free rides on the collective security benefits. NATO's shockingly wobbly performance over Libya, after the Pentagon handed off leadership, should leave no doubt about the Europeans' weaknesses. And while America's... I gotta stop right there. We're blaming NATO. This is New York Times. We're blaming NATO for Libya. That's just ridiculous. That's ridiculous, New York Times Democratic watchers, readers. All right. And while America's NATO partners now have 40,000 troops in Afghanistan, compared with about 99,000 from the United States, many have been hemmed in by restrictive rules of engagement and shortages of critical equipment. Too many are scheduled for imminent departure. I wish ours were. The free rider problem is an old one, but it's gotten even worse over the last 2 decades. During most of the Cold War, the United States accounted for 50% of total NATO military spending. Today, it accounts for 75%. Mr. Gates was right when he warned of America's dwindling patience with allies unwilling to devote the necessary resources or make the necessary changes to be serious and capable partners in their own defense. In their own defense against the impending Libyan attack against the United States? This guy came from the Bush administration. Don't tell me Obama's not more of the same. All right. Decades of underinvestment, poor spending choices, and complacent denial about new challenges have created what Mr. Gates called a two-tiered alliance. He is right that too many of its members limit themselves to humanitarian development, peacekeeping, and talking tasks, and too few are available for the combat missions the alliance as a whole has agreed to assume. Libya, a mission much more directly linked to the security of Europe than of the United States, strikingly illustrates the consequences. No, that is a lie. It has to do with oil only. Fewer than half of NATO's 28 members are taking part in the military mission. Fewer than a third are participating in the all-important airstrikes. British and French aircraft carry the main burden. Canada, Belgium, Norway, and Denmark, despite limited resources, have made outsized contributions. Turkey, with the alliance's second largest military, has remained largely on the sidelines. Germany, NATO's biggest historic beneficiary, has done nothing at all. Even fully participating members have failed to train enough targeting specialists to keep all of their planes flying sorties or buy enough munitions to sustain a bombing campaign much beyond the present 11 weeks. Buy enough munitions from our defense contractors. That should frighten every defense ministry in Europe. What if they had to fight a more formidable enemy than Colonel Muammar al-Gaddafi's fractured dictatorship? Then they would do it! Combat is not always the best or only solution. NATO needs those European development and peacekeeping capabilities. All alliance members must also have at least the basic military capacities to meet common threats. They do! Without that, the alliance will grow increasingly hollow, a fact that enemies will not miss. The enemies know it all! reminds me of the freaking Lee Leffingwell article. It's just completely filled with crap. Listen to the New York Times. Mr. Gates was right to speak out. We hope his likely successor, Leon Panetta, will keep pushing hard. A two-tiered military alliance is really no alliance at all. True. Don't act like NATO was the one that pushed this. The U.S. pushed this. The oil companies pushed the U.S. to do it. They want to secure that. So China doesn't get it. That oil, that 1.8 million barrels per day. Now, the reason I like this editorial is that it illustrates the free rider problem, which is related to the concept of the commons. Each of these countries, through their various governments, are trying to maximize conditions for their people. They're trying to maximize profits, let's say. If it is possible to not contribute, then you don't contribute. Incentives and disincentives. It is like the example of the two shoe tanneries on a river without any regulation at all. I use that as my classic tragedy of the commons question. They spew as much as they can and in as bad a quality as possible. The only way to clean up the river, absent regulation, would be voluntary controls on the pollutants. But in that case, the incentive is to be the free rider, the one who does not voluntarily control his pollutants. That's okay. Everybody needs to maximize. It's our duty to regulate correctly. This, however, in this NATO situation of the free rider, it illustrates the problem with any worldwide regulation, such as Kyoto. Without effective regulation, you must be the free rider. Otherwise, your people starve, at least in the short run. Similarly, if I were a European nation right now, I would not contribute my fair share to NATO's actions. I wouldn't give any money to the UN either. If I were hurting financially, I wouldn't give them a dime. I would just say I can't afford to, and I can't. So it is possible that we have identified a new truth, and that is that voluntary regulation cannot work, as it is contrary to the best interests of the individuals participating in the voluntary program. Again, voluntary regulation cannot work, as it's contrary to the best interests of the individuals participating in the voluntary program. Incentives and disincentives. You don't have an incentive to join the voluntary program. Now, this doesn't mean that you don't do green things and then be able to advertise them. That's not being voluntary. It's actually paying money to change your marketing tactics. So I don't like those arguments that when they say that Exxon is talking about clean coal or whatever. Also, this highlights the problem of the world commons. I've droned on and on about the commons in the U.S. because there is a way. Legislation and constitutional amendments to protect the sovereign commons of the United States. But in the case of the other countries of the world spilling their lead contamination or nuclear fallout or carbon monoxide emissions, without an effective enforcement mechanism that no first world country will ever agree to, I am at a loss over how to control other countries' despoiling of the commons, which would include the world's air and water. Now, I'm not calling for enforcement by the UN, with a UN army that actually has power beyond what we tell them to do, or what China tells them to do, or what Russia tells them to do. I actually don't have an answer for it. I brought this up before. It is a problem. World commons, what do we do? We're able to, because we're surrounded by oceans, we're able to look at this chunk of land that we have and this chunk of air and say, it's costing us this much for coal pollution. Therefore, if we can override the coal industry's ability to influence the legislation and the regulations, we could actually say, since we're paying for the healthcare costs of people 30 and 40 years down the road from lung cancer, then let's go ahead and make them put the most efficient scrubbers there. The coal is there. Coal's not going overseas. Coal's going to be burned in Fayette. All right. I talked last week about Dr. Kevorkian. My friend Scooter in Houston sent me an email. Another intense rant from Goldie. Your points on the camera issue are devastating to those who advocate them. Eventually they will answer your questions. Where are the cameras? Who will see them? Who are they aimed at? Etc. And the debate will move on. For now, they have simply not thought it through. Probably true. I'm quite puzzled by the questions you raised at the end. Do you have the right to commit suicide? What? Do you have the right to tell me I can't? Of course you don't. Signed, Scooter. Scooter, Scooter, Scooter. Before we actually discuss your assertion, I have the right to commit suicide, we need to delve into the meaning of the word right. As we all know, if you commit suicide and someone helps you in 47 or 48 states, not quite sure, that person has committed murder. I mean, in some respects, I have the right to swing my fist, but that right ends where your chin begins, which is the old liberty argument. Like yelling fire in a crowded theater. Your right to freedom of speech is restricted by law. So our society has said that it is illegal to assist someone committing suicide. Our society has allowed life insurance regulations to be written that prevent the payment of life insurance proceeds to the beneficiaries of a person that commits suicide. Makes sense, seems obvious. So it appears that our society has not yet deemed it a right to kill yourself. Maybe it falls under the rubric of the right to privacy, similar to abortion, the way that was distorted to give a right to an abortion from the privacy right. Okay, from my Tea Party friend, and he's the one who's been trying to work this bond proposal where we would put on ballots the amount that your indebtedness would increase, how much you would have to pay per month, per year, for a bond issue that goes up there, say for the courthouse. I'm listening to your rant now. Sounds good. We might have to correct some figures, such as the price for the courthouse is being quoted as $200 to $300 million. I'd said $400 million. A lady in the Travis City Auditor's Office told me they're not allowed to pay off bond they're not allowed to pay off bond debt with new bonds. So not sure about that one yet, but I'm not convinced they don't have a way around that either. She said the money used to pay off bonds is accumulated in an interest and sinking fund, which is supposed to be a line item in the CAFR. I found the CAFR, which does state the outstanding bond debt as of 9/30/10 was something like $636 million, but I have not found that line item yet. The $50 million line item for debt service is in the budget. Budget info is very easy to find on the website. The comprehensive annual financial report is more difficult to find and much more difficult to understand without an accounting or law background. I'm also beginning to wonder why the Travis County Courthouse even needs to be downtown on a $21.8 million lot that is now off the tax rolls. City, sure, but why the county? Why not a big complex out of town somewhere, maybe near a rail stop? Why not at Highland Mall? I also found out that the parking lot they purchased is the site of the original courthouse built in 1855. So there seems to be some sentimental value there. And I have to ask, how are they paying off the bonds since our illustrious mayor said that we do not use taxes to pay off bonds or even pay the interest on the bonds? I think we have something going on here. I mean, you pay it back with funds. The only way they get their funds is fees. Okay, so if you say we've got fees, then you're like the you're like the Texas legislature. You're not calling them taxes. We pay property taxes and we pay fees. So they use fees to pay back the bonds? Anyway, my buddy's going to check out, just try calling like Fidelity and ask him I want to buy some Travis County bonds. How do they get paid back? All right, the current Texas Observer shows the damage wrought by Governor Rick Perry and his boys, and I do mean boys, in the Texas legislature. Rick Perry is going to point to balancing the budget, a lie, without raising taxes, a lie, a fee is a tax, and without dipping into his rainy day fund. True, except for quid pro quos to donors. A true Tea Party fiscal conservative that can run a big, unruly, money-making border state. That's what he's going to call himself. That's what this entire budget was about, him running for president. Amazing. I was watching Fox in the morning of June 14th, 2011, and a commercial came on for class action members who took Zoloft, Paxil, and some other antidepressants during a pregnancy, and asked if your child was born with birth defects like heart and lung defects, cleft palate, etc. Was your child born with birth defects? Did you take Zoloft while you were pregnant? Seriously, you're pregnant and you took a pharmaceutical? Are you effing kidding me? Use some freaking personal responsibility. Don't take pills when you're pregnant. Don't smoke cigarettes. Don't drink alcohol. Drink clean water. Idiots. U.S. Representative Peter King from New York is holding a second round of Islamic terrorist hearings. He was on Fox talking about how in prisons there's a captive audience for radical Islam, and he has evidence that newly converted Muslims are coming out of prison and committing acts of terrorism. So I guess the only two solutions are solitary confinement for everyone with no communication with anyone else, like in Papillon, or try to put less people in prison. That second possibility is not on the table. But I will say, if we put less low-level offenders in prison, there is less of a chance for turning to radical Islam. Are we really wasting taxpayer dollars on these racist hearings? Don't all prisoners in prison learn other criminal techniques, since that is the type of person that they are around during incarceration? Don't they learn how to break into houses? Don't they learn how to steal? Don't they learn white-collar crime? Don't they learn fraud? Should we maybe never let people out of prisons, like Obama and Gitmo? This still looks like pre-election message and pro-war message. The sky is falling, is what I see there. MSNBC reported on June 14, 2011, that Scott's Miracle-Gro, gigantic agricultural fertilizer firm, has announced that it wants to get into the medical marijuana business. It'll be interesting to see if this is true, or a deflection so as to continue the drug war. KIROTV.com reported something that somehow reminded me of my rants about personal responsibility and having children and the role of public schools in raising your children. And it was called 3 Soaked When GPS Guides Car into Mercer Slough, June 15th, 2011. This is in Bellevue, Washington. It's a blue state, by the way, a bunch of Democrats. 3 women escaped injury early Wednesday morning after they say their GPS told them to drive into the Mercer Slough. The women were driving a rental car along Bellevue Way when they said the GPS told them to make a U-turn. Their car ended up going down a boat ramp and into the slough, becoming fully submerged. A KIRO7 photographer could see the taillight still shining below the surface of the water when he arrived after midnight. The women were visiting Bellevue from out of town. Firefighters gave them a ride back to their hotel. Are you that stupid that if your GPS says to drive off a bridge, you would? All right, there's a whole generation of Seinfeld culture, much as there is a whole generation of Hendrix and Zeppelin culture. Plus the additional new youngsters, both of those kinds. I have a friend of mine nicknamed A in Costa Rica in the case of Seinfeld, and the son of Friends, S&G in Dallas, and they listen to Zeppelin. It's kind of cool because you have a shared culture with kids who are really young. It gives a shared experience for many people to build upon, for their own comedy or music. That's all there is today. I want to thank our sponsors, all of which support this form of conversation, but not necessarily the content of this conversation. PianoByAngelo.com, Angelo Limbesis, who teaches and plays keyboards all over Austin. That's my dog. ZetaDesign.com for all of your decorative painting needs. She can make anything look like anything. AustinAreaPlumbing.com for all of your Austin plumbing problems. TicoAdventureLodge.com, small hotel in Samar, Costa Rica. CNC Surf School in Samar, www.cncsurfsamar.webs.com. La Vela Latina, a great sunset bar and restaurant in Samar. They have a great red chair overlooking the beach. Anbar Tequila at www.santospirits.com, an extremely smooth tequila. Another cool 4-unit green hotel in Samar called The Logan at www.thelogansamara.com. And of course, the Delicate Genius in Houston, who is a platinum sponsor. Thanks for coming out.